Today's episode is dedicated in loving memory to Eddie and all of our queer brothers and sisters we've lost to addiction. Welcome to the Sobriety Diaries, friends. My name is Nate. I am a grateful recovering alcoholic 6 years from my last drink. My sobriety is such a huge part of who I am. I decided that I needed to help others find their voice and share their journey too. The Sobriety Diaries is a video podcast where we share powerful stories of recovery told by those who live them. Head on over to thesobrietydiaries.com where you can join our insiders list for exclusive content, early release episodes, and more. Also, please share this podcast with just one person in your life who may still be struggling. You just never know what they may need to hear today. Recovery is possible. Happy Sober Day, friends. Thank you so much for downloading today's episode and spending part of your day with me here on the Sobriety Diaries. Today is part one of a two-part episode with my friend Valentine Darling. Valentine and I met when we were both contributors to an online wellness and recovery conference called the Sober Voices Flow, and have kept in touch since. Valentine is a fellow podcaster and member of the queer community, and we just had such an amazing conversation, such important topics and resources that it turned into 2 episodes. So lucky for you. Like I said, today is part 1. Part 2 will be next Wednesday. And we cover topics ranging from addiction and suicide rates in the queer community, this idea of being California sober, trauma in childhood, getting sober within a 12-step program, the amazing online recovery community that we have both just dove into, and so much more. I am so excited to share my chat with Valentine. So let's get into it. Let's open the diary on Valentine Darling. Valentine Darling, thanks so much for making time today. How are you, my friend?
Hello. I am good. It's bright and sunny today where I'm at, which is unusual.
I'm jealous of that. It is, I think, about 20 degrees and gray and gloomy here. So I'll take some of your sunshine, please. Well, we were saying earlier, it's been a long time coming, and I got kind of nervous this morning, which I don't get. I think maybe just kind of like some of the lead up to it. And, I know we relate on several levels. So I'm excited to chat today.
Me too. This is my first time on a recovery podcast where the host is gay. So I'm like really excited about that.
I love it. Yeah. So we can definitely, I definitely want to touch on, addiction in the queer community and how, you and I as, advocates or, queer individuals who are recovering out loud, what that means. And, I definitely don't take that lightly. So definitely want to get into that a little later on. But what made you decide to, quote, recover out loud or come and share your story here today?
So recovering out loud, someone asked me this recently. My friend Sweet Pea was like, where does this come from? Where does this desire to be like a public face or share publicly come from? And that question actually kind of took me back. Like I was like, I was a little taken back by it. I had to think about it because I wasn't quite sure. She's like, are you modeling this off anyone? And for me, it was like, it wasn't a question. It was just what happened. Like when I finally got sober. So when I first tried getting sober for 5 years in AA, and it never worked for me, and my mental health and my addiction just kept getting worse, and I almost died a couple times. But when I finally was able to come into recovery and get sober and find what worked for me, I was having to create a lot of spaces myself. I was having to find a lot of tools and books that worked for me. And then I was, helping create meetings in my area where I lived so that I had spaces that felt safe for me, had spaces that, We were like, in community looking into recovery wisdom. And so just from the very beginning of that, I started, in leadership positions, which I guess that's where that came from. Just being in leadership positions and needing there to be more spaces where my story was being shared.
I love that. We have to trailblaze, sometimes in not only the queer community, but I think you saying a safe space is the most important thing. And sometimes those more traditional rooms aren't necessarily the safest for people like you and I. So I love that you said that.
Yeah, and there can't be a safe space for everyone. That's why
No.
there needs to be so many different spaces, different recovery programs, different communities, is because, we all need safety in different ways. And, communities are going to look different, you know?
Well, I usually like to start with when was your last drink or drug, and why was it that day in particular?
Hmm. So this is an interesting question for me because I don't identify my recovery as like 100% abstinence from all drugs and alcohol. And that's also because my definition of drugs and alcohol is interesting. Like I consider caffeine a drug. And
Absolutely.
I have this relationship with caffeine that I try not to ever really touch it, but every once in a while I'm allowed a little bit of a caffeine.
Yeah.
But for the most part, if I have caffeine, it causes me harm. But I would say the last time that I like caused myself harm, the last time that I went on like a bender, or basically benders are the main thing that my recovery, like I entered into recovery to move away from going on benders,
Got it.
specifically benders on alcohol, benders on amphetamines and benzos. Like those were the main things, as well as like MDMA. I mean, I did a lot of drugs. Um, and the last time that happened, I was when I was in Hawaii in the pandemic, and which is so funny. It's funny for me to be like, oh, I was in Hawaii because this was the first time I ever had money enough to like go on a vacation on my
Yeah.
own, which I really didn't even have the money. I spent a lot of money I didn't have. And I went there. It was supposed to be with my partner, and then things changed. And then, like, me and my partner were having conversations about breaking up. And I was going there for this photo shoot. And I basically ended up being in Hawaii very alone in the middle of a breakup. I also was in a space that I had, in an area I'd never been in before. And I've traveled a lot in my life, but I've never traveled somewhere where it's not a big city.
Yeah.
And so instead, I'm on this like big island where I have to rent a car and drive everywhere. I didn't know what I was doing. I had so much anxiety. And then I was kind of like stuck in my Airbnb, depressed. And I was also beating myself up because I couldn't get myself to drive across the island. I got myself to do a couple things, but I was mostly just like in this like deep sadness, wishing I had friendships and like friends or anything. um and so I went to a gay bar. And the first gay bar I went to, I had got a sober beer. And I was like, okay, like I can do this. And then the second gay bar I went to, just trying to meet people that I could hang out with while I was on the island, um, I ended up getting an alcoholic beverage. And I didn't like drink to excess or anything in that moment, but it was very much this like, big thing for me. And it slowly progressed. So as I just fell back into old drinking patterns, I went out with these people a couple more times and they drank quite excessively. And then I had hangovers, triggered my panic disorder, days of drinking all day long. And, it was, yeah, just your typical relapse.
Yeah. And this was at the beginning of the pandemic, you said?
Yeah, in the pandemic, yeah.
And how long prior to Hawaii had you abstained from your benders?
Hmm. Years. It had been at least 2 years.
I wouldn't imagine that it alleviated any of the sadness or depression at least maybe coming home from Hawaii, did it?
No, the drinking didn't help anything. I mean,
Yeah.
the drinking just made everything worse. And, I had to like detox and feel like garbage. And um, it's funny using this toxic fucking substance
Yeah.
as a medication because,
Poison, literal
yeah,
poison.
literal poison, literal poison. Um, After I came back and after things with me and Casey were kind of a bit better, I did feel like I received a lot of information from that experience. Like I
Mm.
never look back on the experience when I have a bender and like beat myself up over it. It's more like the thing I was beating myself up over is that I traveled and I wasn't good at it. It wasn't,
Yeah. Yeah.
but the bender itself was like, okay, what information can I get from this? Like what led to this? What caused this? And how can I protect myself in the future? What didn't I do that I could have done? And I felt I always feel a bit stronger after that,
Yeah.
it's especially when it seems very clear to me like what exactly was happening and what I could have done differently.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, if we don't learn and utilize that to prevent it from happening, or utilize the life lesson that perhaps we take away, what's it all for, right? So let's talk a little bit about what led up to not only Hawaii, but I guess since relapse is a part of your story, a bit of your journey leading up to that as well.
And it's funny, I instantly think of the book The Biology of Desire because I just finished reading it. And that
I'm
book,
writing it down.
okay, yeah, The Biology of Desire describes the exact science of what is happening in your body and in your brain when you become addicted. And so as you ask like what led up to it, I'm just like thinking about my experience and thinking about all of the stuff that happened scientifically,
Yeah.
for me to become addicted. And I mean there's so many things that were all happening at once, right, that really led me into my addiction. There was a history of childhood trauma. There was a history of, living in a society where binge drinking and drinking was accessible and, you know, normalized. There is also the people that I was around, the community and culture that I was in. I had multiple experiences with addiction. Like the first experience I had with addiction, I was like 16 years old, 16 to like 20. I got involved in the rave scene, and the rave scene was the first scene where I felt like seen and I felt like accepted. And the rave scene had a lot of drugs, and I discovered ecstasy. And having had so much trauma in my life and so much anxiety and depression, ecstasy was like lifted that away, and I was able to like socialize and kind of witness this potential within myself that I didn't know that I had, and without the ecstasy. And you know years into doing that every weekend, it was fucking up my mental health more. And I was recognizing that I couldn't not do it every weekend. And so I had to move away from that community completely. But I still look back on that time. There's a lot of me that I am able to witness now, that I'm able to access sober, that I got to witness during that time because of ecstasy, if that makes sense. So,
Yeah.
um, but I was able to move away from that without any special program or recovery program. But I did get involved in meditation and Buddhism, and that was super helpful for me to kind of like learn how, like without ecstasy, learn how to like tap into my like peaceful self, tap into a sense of inner calmness, and start healing the childhood trauma, start healing the anxiety and depression. And that lasted for a couple of years. And meditation was like so huge for that, and starting that healing journey. But then I got involved in a kind of like a alternative queer like hipster bar scene in Seattle when I turned 21.
Yes.
Yeah, and I love dancing. So I was like, oh, it has dancing, it has attractive people, everyone had really good style. And I also like felt attractive for the first time. I never felt attractive. I'd always felt like this, like just like this weird gangly creature. And I felt like I was lusted after. And I made really close friends in this community. One of them, became like a lover and a best friend, just like my ride or die. And I remember trying to teach him how to meditate, and he just wasn't into it. I just remember him being like, he's like, all I see is knives everywhere, which that should have been maybe a red flag, but
Maybe, yeah.
I think that was like the last time I meditated for many years. Was and I really just became maybe overly enmeshed with him. He was a little bit older, very successful, had really good style, had money. And I just wanted to be him.
All of the attractive things that,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, we can get caught up in, right?
100%. And so I just was like, okay, well, I kind of, if all of these people in this community don't have to meditate every day to function, then why should I? So instead, I just, you know, went and excessively drank with them multiple days a week and felt beautiful and had a lot of sex. And, that
Can't
that
blame ya.
yeah, it was fun. It was fun, but as they explain in the biology of desire, it was this repetition, right?
Yeah.
This repetition of using alcohol like almost daily, multiple times a week, and then it led to being my main coping mechanism. I stopped having meditation as my coping mechanism. My coping mechanism became drinking wine. And my friend Brian, who was the person that I really looked up to, like, yeah, his main coping mechanism was alcohol. And then he kind of moved away suddenly after years of us being like enmeshed. And what I remember from that was just suddenly like he was gone and I was left with nothing but really terrible drinking habits and like the most soul crushing like abandonment that I had not felt since I was a child. And I really think that, I mean, that trauma definitely triggered a lot of the trauma that I experienced as a child. I experienced a lot of abuse and neglect and trauma as a child from my parents and family and other adults in my life. And so having this happen again, this abandonment, was, yeah, I really do think that's where my addiction to alcohol, like, not that I was using it like in a healthy way, quote unquote healthy way before, but it was like, this is where it got really, really bad. This is where it started destroying everything around me, where I started like dropping out of school and just living off of the money that I made selling drugs and not being able to leave my room for days. And it would get better, and then it would get worse, and then it'd get a little better, and then it'd get worse. And then eventually it got so bad that I had to, I was just in my room for days and lost like my housing and lost any source of income. And I got kicked out of my house and had to enter into rehab.
I relate to that with my addiction to alcohol, wine specifically as well. But at the time, I mean, it's weird to say, but it almost saved my life at the time. It worked for me for a moment in time where I was able to function. I was able to quiet the craziness in my head. I was able to use it to interact with people. I was able to use it to go to work or accomplish things until it stopped working, right? Until I started abusing it, until this poison, as we said, really took over my body.
In Tempest, they talk about the biopsychosocial model of addiction. So there's our vulnerabilities, right? And our like traumas and the reasons that we drink, right? And then we drink to, ease those vulnerabilities and ease those traumas and uh, get away from the things that make us vulnerable. But then overall, by that like long-term use of that substance as a coping mechanism, then goes back and it makes all of those vulnerabilities worse.
So true.
It's like this, it's just a spiral.
Yeah,
that
vicious cycle.
and so yeah, so then for me it's like recovery has been this focus on those vulnerabilities. Like, what are the things that make me vulnerable? What are the reasons that were underneath that I was trying to move away from?
You said something about AA originally,
Mm,
and I started my recovery journey in the rooms. Since of course have found this amazing online recovery community and these fellow podcasters and recovery podcasts that help me so much in this recovery literature and meditation and different things that I do to work on myself,
mhm.
and love AA and what it stands for and the program, and I think that it does a lot of amazing things, but I have since sort of veered to us who
Mhm.
rely more on this sort of sober online community
Mhm.
and for the support, for the guidance, for the direction. And maybe we can touch on some thoughts or reasons why you think that the program didn't work for you.
Yeah. Oh, and there's a lot I can unpack here. I mean,
Yeah.
after trying to make it work for me for a really long time, I have a lot of religious trauma. I was, abused within the church as a child. And so coming into a program where they're just even the language that they're using to describe everything is language that's directly from Christian church,
Yeah.
like even the word fellowship, all of the different language that they're using is language coming from the Christian church. And it's based on Christianity. It's based AA is based on the idea that through confession comes change.
Yep.
And using a higher power, helps you heal. And that's all beautiful, nothing wrong with that. But I had this religious trauma, and this was not like praying the gay away was
Yeah.
something that I tried to do as a child, and I was not going to try. But praying the sobriety way also did not work. But what is more interesting to me now to think about is how another aspect that wasn't working for me was this, because I found this in more than one recovery program, is the singular approach to recovery, a singular approach to wisdom. And when I came into recovery, I had a really open mind, but I kind of had to close it a little bit for a while because I was, terrified, and I needed to figure out what to do next to not end up dying, not to go on a bender and try to commit suicide again.
Yeah.
And so, but then, so I tried different recovery programs out, and I gave it my all. But then, and this became like my spiritual quest, right? And when I say spiritual, I mean like this became like a journey of self-development. And I didn't really stop with one recovery program, because what I needed didn't exist in just one. And I found when I went to AA and when I went to Buddhist recovery, there's many different Buddhist recovery programs, but they're very similar to AA in the sense that their wisdom all comes from a singular source. AA has their approved literature, and so their wisdom is all coming from this one place. And in Buddhist recovery, it's their wisdom is coming from Buddhism is beautiful and vast, and I love it, and it's helped me so much, and it's helped me heal, and I give it so much credit, and but I found myself stuck because there was more growth that I needed, and I was not going to find it within this one recovery program. And I
Mm.
saw this like binary suddenly. I was like, oh, well, like in my life now there's 12 steps and there's Buddhism. And I really didn't like that binary. I didn't like it when there was just a singularity. And then I also didn't like it when it's a binary. Because if you think about binary, it's like binary thinking is this idea that there's good and there's bad, and there is right and wrong, there is male and female, there is heaven or hell. And like those aren't really choices. That's
Right.
still like confining you into a box. And so I kept exploring. I kept exploring to see what the fuck else was out there. Like I was
Yes.
like, there must be
There
more.
must be.
Yeah. And so I've actually been directly a part of at least 8 or more recovery programs now. And I get so much more wisdom out of each one that I explore. And that's a part of what I'm doing for Recovery Disco is I just want to go and explore all the different communities and recovery programs out there, and then share about them so that to help make it more accessible to people. So they don't end up having to be like me where, they feel stuck and only have like, limited resources. Because it took me a long time to find all of the recovery programs out there. So I'm just kind of on this journey to keep sharing them.
I love that. So, since I'm glad you brought it up, is that the focus of your podcast, Recovery Disco, sort of exploring these different programs and different means to recovery?
Yeah, and it's also like exploring recovery in this like larger sense, right? That we're recovery from addiction, we don't own the term recovery. Like people are in recovery from trauma, people are in recovery from religious trauma, people are in recovery from the gender binary, they're in recovery from abusive relationships, they're in recovery from disordered eating. There's so much out there that people are in recovery from. And when I think of the term recovery, I think of recovery as this alternative way of living where we need to center healing and community.
Mm.
And so I like to, in my podcast, explore not only like addiction recovery communities, but also the experiences of people in different forms of recovery and what we can learn from that, and how we can be more open and inclusive. Because I do find in recovery, there tends to be this kind of like, oh, you can't sit at our table. Like your recovery is different from our recovery, so you can't sit at our table. And I wanna let go of that kind of
Yes.
that puritanical idea about recovery and see how we can actually listen to each other and hold space for each other, so no one is being isolated outside of different recovery communities because their recovery is different.
Everyone can find their own path to recovery, right? And, you speaking and exploring these different journeys and paths is beautiful. But I think that, there seems to be one constant, and that is the community. And if you
Mhm.
are able to surround yourself with like-minded individuals and, people who share, perhaps the lived experience, I think that seems to be a constant, at least with most alcoholics that I speak to. So
And
there are many ways to get there, but I think community is a large part of a lot of them.
and I would say it goes even further than people needing to have the same experience or even be super like-minded. It's just like people that are safe to be around are people that honor and respect your recovery, and they honor and respect what you tell them. Because I'm in recovery communities where our all of our recoveries are so vastly different. Like we're doing it in very different ways. We have different relationships with different substances, but the important thing is that we all honor and respect each other's recovery,
Yes.
And so like I have this relationship with caffeine where I can only have very little sometimes, but mostly I just stay away from it completely. But I don't, I can have friends with people that drink caffeine.
Yeah.
I don't have friends with people that try to force caffeine on me or tell me that I need to drink caffeine or belittle my experience with caffeine. There are communities where people are, when someone's trying to tell, if someone's sober from alcohol and someone's telling you that, you should be able to moderate, that's fucked up.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk, I think, in sober communities against moderation these days. And I understand it. I understand it from a place of like having tried to moderate and not working and almost dying from trying to force moderation to work for you. But then what I think is getting left out is that just because someone moderates or just because someone is Cali sober, that doesn't mean that that has to work for you as well. And just because it didn't work for you doesn't mean you have to invalidate someone else's experience. Part of what inspired me to talk to you about this today was I've been seeing this for a long time, but it's just starting to really get to me. Like when I go into a recovery forum or a Facebook group and I see people asking questions like if I eat a piece of tiramisu cake, like do I have to restart my recovery date?
Yeah.
Or if I have a kombucha, am I cheating my recovery? Or if I have a non-alcoholic beer, am I cheating my recovery? And this I it's just like after seeing this for so long, I'm starting to realize like why this makes me really uncomfortable. And there's a couple reasons why it makes me uncomfortable. First, I mean, it's so related to like toxic diet culture. Like, am I
Yes.
cheating in my recovery, right? And and it's also this focus on your recovery being centered around external validation.
Mm.
You're not listening to whether or not this is going to be okay for you in your recovery. You're specifically asking if you will still be seen as like perfect and pure in your recovery in somebody else's eyes, not your own. And I think the real question here should be that, like, is this going to cause me harm? Is this piece of tiramisu going to trigger me to cause myself harm? Is this kombucha gonna trigger me to cause myself harm?
Yeah.
Is this non-alcoholic beer gonna make me crave real beer, or is it gonna help me heal? Is it gonna
Yeah.
make me feel more comfortable in this moment and make me actually not want or need another beer? And I know people that are triggered by kombucha. I know people that are triggered by tiramisu. I know people that are triggered by mocktails, but I also know so many people that are not triggered by these things, and they're so helpful. And I think that it should be more individualized.
Yeah.
We shouldn't always be looking outward. I think that external wisdom and internal wisdom should be seen as like equally important.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah, and it's almost like the intention behind it. You know,
Mm-hmm.
are you drinking this NA beer to kickstart a bender, or is it going to satisfy this craving that you have? So it's can totally be a personalized experience, and I think it speaks to this sort of culture that we've developed where external validation is more important to us than the internal, and it's sad in a way.
Yeah. And I think I also relate to this because my recovery and even other parts of myself were very much based on purity for for quite a while. In my like I was vegetarian for a long time because of my relationship with Buddhism, and vegan at times as well. And then when I was in recovery, it was, very much black and white for a long time. I was, I didn't see any wiggle room in recovery, or it's like, for me it was like sobriety is defined as sober from all substances except for caffeine and nicotine, and
Right.
and this is like a definition somebody else created,
Yeah.
but this was what became my mantra for recovering, for sobriety. And then I had my partner, who has had really, you treatment resistant depression for a really long time. And he got sober a year into our relationship, and but his depression kept, has been really bad for many years, and it would get really bad, and sometimes he would talk about marijuana, and I would always be like, no, 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 no. Like, I wouldn't listen to that as if that was his intuition,
Yeah.
maybe saying this might be helpful. It was more like, oh, you're having a craving. Like, what else can we do? Let's meditate.
Yeah.
And then one day I like really heard him, and I was like, oh, like, do you think this would be helpful? He had a little bit, and it shook him out of his depression. And it was just really powerful to see. And I was like, oh, okay, there is some truth to the idea that there is this plant medicine, right?
For sure. Yeah.
And that it can, for some people, have medicinal value and act in a healing way.
Stay tuned for part 2 of my chat with Valentine Darling next Wednesday, same time, same place. We dive in a little bit more to addiction in the queer community and what a beautiful life in recovery can look like. Thanks so much for listening today, friends. Hopefully you heard something that resonates with you, and if we help just one person, our job is done. Make sure you check out today's show notes for all of the information on today's episode and how to connect with our guest. You can find all things podcast related and subscribe to our show at thesobrietydiaries.com, youtube.com/Nate Kelly, where we upload today's video podcast, and on Instagram at the Sobriety Diaries Pod. Check back every Wednesday for new episodes with new stories to tell. But until then, try your best not to drink and be good to yourself. Bye, friends.